Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. I've got the top of the hour. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. I just want to go over some brief housekeeping items. During the presentation, please mute yourself by pressing *6. And if you have a difficult time hearing our speaker, just press *6 again to unmute yourself. You can also use the chat feature, which is found on the right side of your screen, to ask a question during the presentation if you'd like. And we will have a question and answer session at the end. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. We will provide a link to this presentation from our website in probably about a week or two after today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker and let him introduce himself. And you all have a great day. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Josh Sizzler. I'm a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at the Psychiatric Research Institute at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Most of what I do is brain imaging research amongst trauma-exposed populations, and we're working more specifically with adolescent girls who have some history of physical or sexual assault, and we're working with adult women who also have some history of physical or sexual assault. In addition to the research, I also do some clinical work. I'm also about 30% clinical, and most of the treatment I do is individual cognitive behavioral therapy with adult victims of trauma or adults with anxiety disorders. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the research that we're doing here on social decision-making amongst trauma victims, both adolescents and adults, and some of the implications that social decision-making has for the treatments that we do and for understanding the risk for revictimization amongst this population. So just to kick things off, we'll go over the prevalence of interpersonal violence. And as you all are probably familiar with, this is a very prevalent problem. So there's been some research done, some epidemiological studies, and when we look at adolescents, age 12 to 17, we typically find that about 50% of them report having been exposed to some type of either physical violence, sexual violence, or witnessing violence. That's a pretty high number, about 50%. And we actually see about the same prevalence rate of interpersonal violence exposure among adults. And, you know, you expect that adults would have either the same prevalence rate or a little bit higher, but because of differences in methodology, differences in the way that people are asked about the trauma that they're exposed to, you actually don't see the exact same numbers. But it's about the same in adolescents and adults. And the take-home message here is just that it's a very high number. And what has always been interesting and concerning to me is that there's research showing that people who have been exposed to interpersonal violence are actually at greater risk for new violence exposure. So I'll show a little bit of the research that's been done on this. This is a study that I was involved in when I was at the Medical University of South Carolina. And in this study, we found 3,600 adolescents, aged 12 to 17, and they were followed for a 3-year period. At time 1, we measured how much trauma they've been exposed to, specifically either physical assault, sexual assault, or witnessed violence. And then we found them again in a year and asked them the same questions, specifically how many new interpersonal violence exposures have you experienced, found them again 2 years later, and asked them again. So what we could do with this type of design is we can ask, does being exposed to assault make you more likely to experience new assault later? And that's exactly what we found. So what we found is that children who had been exposed to more interpersonal violence at time 1 were at a greater likelihood for experiencing new revictimization in that 2-year follow-up period. And this was done within a latent growth curve modeling approach. So intercept here just refers to how much assault that they had at time 1, and then slope just refers to how much of a change in that assault history they had over the 3-year period. So what we're seeing is there's a relationship between those two. Children who had more assault at time 1 were more likely to have greater increases in new assault exposures over the 3-year period. And similar research has been done among adults, and what that research has found is that this was done among women, and it was also longitudinal design that was followed over a 3-year period. And this research found that women who were exposed to interpersonal violence at time 1 were 4.5 times more likely to have a new personal violence exposure within that 2-year follow-up period. So what I think this highlights is just the idea that being exposed to violence is not a one-time occurrence, or not necessarily a one-time occurrence, that the experience of being exposed to that type of violence puts you at risk for suffering new exposure. So I would like to know why that is. Why is it the case that people, children or adults, who've been exposed to early life violence, why are they more likely to experience new victimization? And you could actually think, or one could make the case that from a PTSD perspective, that when we're talking about hypervigilance, you might actually think that someone who's been exposed to interpersonal violence would be more vigilant for danger and therefore less likely to be re-victimized. But as I'm showing with these data, victims of interpersonal violence are actually at greater risk. So it's opposite to what you might intuitively think. So why is that? What's going on with that? So I'm going to tell you all about one study that we have completed here. This was a study where we compared brain function between adolescent girls who have some history of assault exposure to adolescent girls with no history of assault exposure. And on this slide, I'm just showing some characteristics of the sample. So we had 14 girls who had a history of either directly experienced physical or sexual assault. And we had 16 girls, control girls, who had no assault. You can see that their ages were pretty well matched. The demographics, ethnicity was pretty well matched. Their IQs were pretty well matched. But what you would see is that some of the clinical symptoms were higher among the assaulted girls relative to the control girls, which is, of course, what you would expect. And what we did in this study was we had girls go through a social decision-making task while they were in the fMRI scanner. So we got to look and see what their brains were doing while they were doing the social decision-making task. I'm going to explain what the task was. What these girls saw were these 3 faces, and we told them that the computer to give some of their money to one of these 3 faces, and that person is either going to take the money or keep it, and the participant's job is just to pay attention and try to figure out who is the most trustworthy person. So just an example, they'll see $10 of their money go to person 2 here. Person 2 gives the money back plus $10. That's one outcome. The person can give the money back plus $10. And another type of trial, here the money is going to person 3, and person 3 is taking the money. So, and the game's kind of rigged, so the person on the left is more likely to give the money back. 80% of the time she gives the money back. The person in the middle is random. Half the time she gives it, half the time she takes it. And the person on the right most likely takes the money, so she only gives it back 20% of the time. And then halfway through the task, we switch these probabilities. So this person who was trustworthy is now untrustworthy, and this person who was untrustworthy is now trustworthy. So we do that to kind of create this high conflict. The children have to kind of establish what their expectations for these and their opinions of these people are. And after each trial, they're asked to rate who do they think is the most trustworthy person. So each trial, they give us an estimate of who they think is the most trustworthy person based upon what they've seen. Do with that type of design, at brain activation, when someone sees something expected versus when they see something unexpected. For example, that girl on the left, like I mentioned, gives the money back 80% of the time. So what happens is over time we develop this expectation that she is going to give the money back, but 20% of the time she doesn't. We can compare brain activation to an expected outcome, that activation to an unexpected outcome, and we can look and see how does the brain change when we have this unexpected social outcome. So, for example, when the person you think is trustworthy behaves untrustworthy, how does your brain respond to that? So what we're seeing on the left here is we are seeing brain activity among the control girls specifically, and we're comparing brain activation when there's something unexpected to something that's expected. And more specifically, these are unexpected bad outcomes. So this is when the girl on the left, who you think is trustworthy, when she takes your money. So when there's an unexpected bad outcome compared to an expected, what does your brain do? So in these control girls, what we're seeing is activation in this very specific network of the brain. It's kind of a salience network and allows us to detect important things, changing things in our environment. So what we have here is the anterior insula. Anterior means it's forward. The regions here is the insular cortex. And we have the dorsal anterior cortex. And the color here just represents the amount of activation. So a brighter color means more activation. And what this network allows us to do, this network between the anterior insula and the dorsal anterior insula, what that lets us do is that lets us identify things that are kind of unexpected. So like I said, it's a salience network. So when there's something important in our environment that we need to pay attention to, this network kicks on and it really helps us focus our attention. That's exactly what you'd expect. That's exactly what's going on in this task. Something unexpected is happening, and in these control girls' brains, we're seeing evidence that they are detecting something unexpected. They're detecting something salient. So this is exactly what we would expect. And then on the right, what I'm showing is the comparison between control girls and assaulted girls. The color here is blue, and what that actually represents is less activation among the assaulted girls. But you directly compare the images on the left to the images on the right, and you can see that in the control girls, whereas we were seeing activations in these regions, significantly less activation assaulted girls. Less activation in the anterior cingulate, activation in the anterior insula. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing neural evidence that the assaulted girls are not detecting this event, or at least they are not registering it as a salient event that they need to pay attention to. Remember, this is a salience network, and the control girls are showing an activation of that network as though they've just seen something salient they need to pay attention to. The assaulted girls are not showing evidence of that. They're showing significantly less detection of a salient event, suggesting that unexpectedly bad social behavior is being registered less by these girls. That's brain activation. And one other slide I'll show you with the hippocampus. As you're probably familiar with, hippocampus is involved in memory, code memory. And remember, this is a learning task, so we were asking them to try to figure out who the most trustworthy girl was. And we're also seeing that the assaulted adolescent girls were showing less activity in the hippocampus, suggestive that they were encoding this information to a less degree than the control girls, which seems pretty relevant because you would hope that an unexpected negative event is being remembered. And although you can't do a one-to-one correspondence between brain activity activity and cognitive function, so I don't know for certain that the assaulted encoding the memory. This activation pattern is consistent with the idea that they were encoding the memory loss. That's the brain activity, and then we can also look at, well, how do they do in the task? How is their performance? So here we're looking at performance from the perspective they chose what's considered the correct choice. So there are 96 total trials. After each trial, the girl indicates who they think the most trustworthy person was. Left, you can see that about 57 times on average, for example, the assaulted adolescents chose the correct face. And the correct face kind of changes over time because it's based on probability. And at any one given time, who actually was the most trustworthy girl changed a little bit across the experiment. So this was a somewhat difficult task. But when you look across the groups, on average, the control girls were more likely to make correct decisions. They were more likely to use the actual information that they were getting to make the best decision about who was empirically, under the probability, who was the most trustworthy girl, who was most likely to give the money back. But compared to the control girls, the assaulted adolescents made significantly less accurate decisions about who was the most trustworthy. This is comparing control to assaulted, and we can also look as a function of the severity of the assault exposure. 16 girls who had no assault exposure, about 8 girls who were exposed to either 1 or 2 assaultive events, and then the remainder of the assaulted girls actually had a very severe assault history, were exposed to 3 or more different types of assaultive events. Is that how accurate they were on the task, but, varying as a function of the severity of their assault exposure. Assault exposure associated with even worse, or I should say even less accurate judgments about who the most trustworthy girl was. So to kind of summarize what we're getting from this task is in terms of brain activation, we're seeing less evidence that the assaulted girls were responding to unexpected social behavior as a salient event that they needed to respond to. And in terms of behavior, we are actually seeing less accurate trust judgment. And when I say less accurate, I mean less accurate relative to the actual behavior, the actual calculate the probability that the fake people on the computer were doing, and the assaulted girls were making objectively less accurate decisions. That's some of the data that we have on the adolescent girls. Here we use some data, a study that we're doing with adult women. Ongoing study. Right now we have 14 participants, all women with a diagnosis of PTSD related to interpersonal violence. And this is a pretty severe sample that we have. They have severe history of trauma. Most of them have a combined history of early life trauma and interpersonal violence that they experienced during adulthood as well. Mean age is about 30. About half of them also have comorbid depression. And what we did in this task was we had what's called a trust game. They believed that they were playing with a Confederate. We actually brought them into a room where they interacted with what they believed to be another person through a computer. So they never saw the other person, but we just had some different manipulations, so the participants thought they were playing with someone else. These are the instructions that the participants saw before starting the trust game. So what they're told is that they're going to be the investor here, and they're told that they're going to play a series of trials with this other person. They're going to start with $10 on each trial, and they're going to get to choose an amount of money to give that other person. So in this example, the investor chooses to give $5 over to the investee. On the way over to the investee, we triple that amount. So in this example, the investor gave $5, the investee actually $15, and then the investee gets to choose how much money he gives back to the original investor. So in this example, the investee chooses to give back $8. So what we tell participants here is that their job here is to try to get as much total money back as possible. That's their objective. They're trying, in order for them to win this game, so to speak, they want to get as much money back. And we, to give them an incentive, we tell them that we will give them an additional monetary compensation proportionate to how much money they make in this game. So they actually have a motivation to try to do well. And this task is actually, the participants don't know this, but the task is divided up into 3 separate phases. In phase 1, the Confederate investee, and I have that in quotes because there actually isn't an investee. They think they're playing with Confederate, but they're really playing with the computer, is giving back a certain amount of money. In the first phase, the investee gives back about 50% of the investor's investment. So if the participant, who can choose up to $10, if chooses to give $5, on the way to the participant, it becomes 15. In the first 5 trials, that fake investee will give back on average $8, so about 50%. And that's actually normative. When you do this with real people, on average, most people will give back about 50%. So in the first 5 trials, our participant experiences normative behavior from that Confederate. But then, in the second phase, we manipulate it so that the Confederate is starting to short the participant. They're now decreasing the money they're giving back. And then in the third trial, they come back to normal. So we do this on purpose. We start with normal behavior. We get to see how the participant responds to normal behavior. And then when the Confederate starts to short them, what we want to know is, how does the participant change their investor behavior when the other person starts to short them? And then, after they've had this 5 trials of being shorted, we have this kind of return to baseline. We can see how the participants. Yeah. So the manipulation worked. The first phase, on average, people invested about 60% of what they could have, so that's $6 on average. In the second phase, when the Confederates started to short them, on average, people dropped their investment. So it went from about $6, then on average, they're investing $3. And then the third phase, when the Confederate was giving more back, people again increased their investment. So we're seeing that the manipulation worked. But what's really interesting that we're seeing is in that critical second phase, when the Confederate starts to unexpectedly behave negatively, right? They are now shorting the participant. They're giving less than they used to. What we are seeing is that the women who have more severe history of childhood assault, they're giving more in the second phase. So remember, in the second phase, what typically happens is people reduce their investment, right? So I'm playing with someone, I'm giving money, I'm getting some back, and that other person starts to short me. Most people's tendency is then to invest less. They invest less. But what we're seeing is that the women who have more severe histories of early life assault exposure, they are not decreasing their investment behavior. So this is very similar to what we saw with the adolescent girls. The adolescent girls demonstrated less responsiveness to unexpected social behavior. And here, among the women with PTSD, those women who had a more severe history of assault in childhood, they were also showing less responsiveness to unexpected negative social behavior. So that's actually an interesting finding because it's consistent across 2 different tasks, across 2 different populations. So what we're seeing is we're getting some pretty good preliminary evidence that early life assault exposures associated with this unresponsiveness to unexpected negative social behaviors. So that's, like I said, it's consistent across the two studies that we've done. And it's starting to suggest a specific deficit in social decision-making, such that early life trauma, specifically early life assault, might be associated with these deficits in decision-making, specifically less either detection or less responsiveness when someone else is displaying some unexpected negative behavior. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears slightly here, and I'm going to talk about some other emerging data that we have on family context within our assaulted adolescent girls. And this is related because you can definitely make the case, and as clinicians we can all appreciate that in some of these families that we work with, they're typically pretty chaotic. A lot of the abuse happens within the home. Sometimes there's different levels of support that the child might experience after the abuse. When we're talking about risk for revictimization, when we're talking about social decision-making and social cognition, it's really important to consider what is the family dynamic amongst these assaulted adolescents. Not just focusing on the assault that they experience, but focusing on what's the family context among that assault victim. What social context is that individual growing up in? So in these data that I'm going to talk about, it's based on a total N of 48. We've got 17 control adolescents. We've got 31 adolescent girls with a history of assault exposure. And here, the data we're looking at is a caregiver for each of these girls completed a scale that measures family characteristics. It's Family Adaptability and Cohesion Scale. This scale has 6 subscales. So it characterizes 6 aspects of family functioning. It characterizes cohesion, which is the degree to which the family members are involved in each other's lives in a healthy way. It measures flexibility, so the degree to which the family can adjust problems. It measures disengagement, so the degree to which the family members operate independently. Enmeshment, the degree to which family members are too dependent on each other. Rigidity, so the degree to which the family adheres strictly to rules or structure. And it measures chaotic aspects of the family, so the degree to which the family is unorganized. So, for example, if there's unclear responsibility, it's unclear who the leader is, there's unclear structure, etc. So, like I said, a caregiver for each of these adolescents completed this measure. So it's not the adolescent's perspective of the family. It's actually coming from the caregiver themselves. So when we compare those two groups, when we compare the assaulted and blue control groups, we see significant differences in the caregiver rating of the family context in 5 of these 6 domains. So the control caregivers rate the family as more cohesive. Control caregivers rate their family as more flexible. But controls also rate, caregivers rate less disengagement. They rate less enmeshment. And they rate less chaos in the family. They didn't differ in rigidity. So it's not, and remember, this is not coming from the assaulted adolescent. So it's not the assaulted adolescent who's displaying a lot of clinical symptoms, you might obviously expect that they might rate things in their family as worse. This is not coming from the adolescent. This is coming from the caregiver. And the caregiver is saying that the family basically is not working as well. Typically, we think of the cohesion and the flexibility scales as more adaptive aspects of functioning, and we're seeing significantly less adaptive aspects of the family functioning. So these 4 scales as more of the maladaptive aspects of functioning, significantly more of this maladaptive functioning in the assaulted adolescent families. And I think that's really important for understanding social decision-making, and I think that's certainly important for understanding risk for revictimization, because what this is suggesting, at least, that these assaulted adolescents not only have they had the experience of assault, but their family life is, the family characteristics are less adaptive. So they're also growing up in that social context. So then we can kind of jump to some clinical implications. An overview, what we're talking about is that victims of IPV are at a greater risk for re-victimization. Research that we're conducting is suggesting some specific deficits in social decision-making, specifically that assaulted adult women are showing less responsiveness to unexpected negative social behavior. And we're also seeing significant family dysfunction amongst our adolescent girls. So what I think at least for me as a clinician, the take-home message for this is that we shouldn't neglect aspects of social functioning. I think oftentimes, this might be my bias just based on the training that I've had, but oftentimes we focus mostly on the child's emotional function. Might be focusing on whether or not the child's PTSD symptoms are decreasing, or we might be focusing on whether the child's depression is decreasing. But I think what this is suggesting, this larger research context is suggesting that we really shouldn't be neglecting aspects of social functioning. And I also think that it's definitely possible to incorporate these aspects into our existing treatment. So just using the context of TFCBT, the TFCBT is already set up to make sure that the clinician can address these aspects of functioning. So for example, TFCBT ideally is going to involve the consistent involvement of a caregiver, which provides the clinician the opportunity to assess aspects of family functioning. And what's the broader context in the family? Is there a lot of disengagement? Is there a lot of chaos in the family? And by working with the parent and by addressing parenting skills, the clinician can definitely assess those aspects of functioning, can definitely intervene with the parent or the caregiver to try to address those broader aspects of the family dynamics. TFCBT also includes a module on teaching cognitive coping skills, and more specifically working on that thought, feeling, behavior triangle. So how do thoughts influence feelings and vice versa? How do feelings influence behavior and vice versa? And within this module, what we can focus on as clinicians are the child's perceptions of social situations. So how is the child thinking about different types of social activities? One example I can think of from my own clinical experience is working with some adolescents going into different parties. What is their recognition of danger when there's alcohol involved? What is their recognition of danger around older people that they're not necessarily familiar with? And how can you work with that child to identify what their perceptions of these situations are? And how can you work with the child to identify what effect that their behavior might have on other people? Right? So really trying to incorporate social situations into the cognitive coping skills. I think oftentimes, or it's easy to see how cognitive coping skills can apply to trauma-related issues. So maybe we might talk about how a child with PTSD might have maybe exaggerated perception of danger or harm. And I think the cognitive coping skills would definitely map directly onto that distortion. But I think I guess the message I'm saying is that these children might also have distortions more broadly about social situations, about safety with people, safety situations, and we can target those as well within the same module. This module is addressing the child's future safety. So within that module, it's definitely possible for the clinician to discuss different aspects of risky situations. So making sure that we address what is healthy dating behavior, what are healthy boundaries, how can the child use appropriate assertiveness skills to get them out of potentially risky situations or make sure that they're not in the risky situation. And also, what could be helpful is to talk about, in an appropriate way, to talk about how there might be a risk for future victimization and how being in a family that was abusive or having a caregiver that was abusive, how that can sometimes affect how we think about other people and how maybe just an awareness of that risk can help people be more mindful of how they're thinking about situations, and maybe, like I said, it might even reinforce using assertiveness skills to keep them safe in these situations. So that is what I had prepared to talk about. The last slide that I'm putting up is for those of you who are not familiar. We are doing a treatment study at UAMS where we're providing CBT free of charge for adolescent girls between the ages of 11. I'm not going to talk about that. I'll just leave that up there if you all want to contact information up there. And at this point, I will just turn it over to any questions or questions. And it's *6 to take yourself off mute. Any questions? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to get to share some of the research that we are doing. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.